Welcome, sleepless spirit. I'm your storyteller tonight, here to guide you gently into the shadows of slumber, where dreams take over and worries fade away. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more bedtime tales, whispered just for you. Let me know in the comments, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it as you listen tonight? And if there's a story you've been longing to hear, something spooky, something comforting, tell me. I'm always listening. Now, tuck yourself in. Let the darkness wrap around you like a warm blanket. It's time to let go and drift into the story. When you're out in the middle of nowhere, you see all kinds of wildlife on the road, not deer or rabbits like most people think, but some genuinely strange creatures that'll make your skin crawl. I've been driving trucks for more than 10 years. And the only thing I ever worried about in the early hours of the morning was staying awake. It was mid-August, and I had just pulled onto a remote dirt road on one of my, while taking my break and stretching my legs, I heard an odd rustling in the nearby bushes. Of course, my first thought was an animal, possibly a coyote or even a bobcat. But this was not the case. The sky was clear, but a stone must have blown through recently, because the air had that distinct smell of rain mixed with dust. There were no other cars nearby, so it was ideal for a quick pit stop. As I shined my flashlight into the darkness, beyond the bushes, I caught a glimpse of something that sent shivers down my spine. Long fingernails scraping against hardwood flooring. The noise seemed different, more deliberate, almost stealthy, like a predator stalking its prey. It moved from one spot to another, making it difficult to pinpoint where it was coming from. However, as soon as I blinked, it vanished into thin air, and I made the decision to pack up and depart right away before I could learn more about what was out there. After what I had just seen, my curiosity as a trucker had somewhat subsided. But before I could finish packing and get back into my cab, something heavy struck the hood of my truck with a tremendous thud, and my blood ran cold when I saw a real human figure staring back at me through. I couldn't tell if this person was male or female, but they had matted hair and tattered clothes hanging off their lanky frame. Their pupils were fully dilated, and they had a bloody tire iron still dripping onto the hood in their hand. I slammed the door behind me, locked it, and used my radio to call for help, hoping against hope that anyone inside would be there, range, would hear my distress signal. But before I knew it, this deadly stranger had circled to my driver's side window and was smashing it in with terrifying force. Glass shards were falling all around me like heavy rain for what seemed like hours. When the stranger finally got a good crack through the window, his distorted face filled my vision, and he sneered at me before raising the tire iron once more. I knew without a doubt that this thing was about to attempt to bash my face in a sudden burst of noise from my radio, which must have startled him, because he immediately backed away, and I saw the headlights of another truck rapidly approaching. In the distance, the relief and gratitude that struck me were indescribable, and this stranger fled into the darkness just as my brother Mark, a fellow trucker I had known 4 years, came to my aid, but we were unable to find the stranger decipher. Days later, while conversing with other truckers at a diner located quite a distance out of town, we exchanged stories about our experiences out on the desolate roads of Arizona. It seemed that similar incidents had occurred to others on multiple occasions, but the local authorities did their best to find out who they were or where they came from, but they were never able to solve this mystery. As the stranger fled and brother Mark arrived, I noticed that they dropped an old, weathered wallet into the darkness, thinking it might hold some clue to the identity of the assailant. I picked it up, brushing off the dirt and grime, but I still can't get rid of the fear that one lonely night on a desert road, a figure with a bloody tire iron might just appear again. I called out to my fellow trucker, who was inspecting the dents on my car. "Look, Mark, look what I found." He narrowed his eyes and squinted at it, saying, "It looks like someone's wallet." We opened the worn leather fold and discovered a driver's license inside, with a face that matched the attacker's matted hair, hollow eyes, and all. Curiosity drove us to research the background of this enigmatic individual at the local library. As we dug deeper into old newspaper articles and internet records, we learned that Oliver Hendricks, an Arizona resident, had been a good citizen years prior. Little did we know that discovering this name would lead us down a rabbit hole of tragedy and newfound connection. A good man with a wife and 2 children, Oliver's life unfortunately took a bad turn when he struggled with debt after losing his job. Desperate to provide for his family, Oliver turned to a criminal lifestyle, with robbery serving as his main source of income. As time passed with no positive influences in his life or hope that his circumstances would improve, Oliver started abusing drugs, which further transformed him into the malevolent character who assaulted me with that bloody tire iron. Unable to disregard our findings or fail to notify the police, Mark and I informed the local authorities of our findings, and they promised to look for Oliver with renewed vigor. They were aware of Oliver's criminal history, but they never linked him to the attacks on truckers like me that occurred in the weeks following during my encounter with Oliver Hendricks. I couldn't help but think about the man he was before his life went out of control. Although it wasn't the main topic of conversation at the diner anymore, Oliver continued to occupy my thoughts during the long drives when my only companion was my thoughts. At times, I couldn't get rid of the ghostly visage that was staring at me from my windshield, his face twisted in rage. It was painful to realize that Oliver was once just like me, earning a living from trucking before everything went wrong. I was fortunate that my family had not yet experienced misfortune, but the savagery within him was dormant inside all of us. The story served as a chilling reminder that even in our darkest hours, we must, even though I felt like Oliver's shadow was still hovering over me, knowing that it wasn't personal gave me a sense of peace. Life went on, and with law enforcement on high alert due to Oliver's attacks, it appeared that nothing would happen again for the time being. So, I continued, driving under the Arizona sky, hold on to humanity or risk becoming monsters ourselves. It all started on a sunny afternoon in mid-July when I was hauling timber on my regular route through the forested areas of the Pacific Northwest. My name is Zephyr McAllister, but my name is Zephyr McAllister. I was driving through an open desert that was trenched in moonlight, keeping an eye out for any signs of his haunting presence. Roads stretched 4 miles ahead, and stories unfolded in their shadows, some dark secrets waiting to be unraveled, while others remained buried. I've been a truck driver for as long as I can remember, logging millions of miles on the open road. This particular run has always been one of my favorites. It had a certain wild beauty. You know, I stopped for lunch at a roadside diner called Bill's Grub Shack, where I first heard rumors of a series of strange incidents and unexplained attacks occurring along my route. As an experienced driver and connoisseur of butt, that day was different. Shortly after finishing my meal, I got back into my rig and headed out again. The traffic was unusually light, which made the normally serene atmosphere feel a little bleak. Then, something caught my attention up ahead. A car was pulled over to the side. Normally, I just listened to truck stop gossip with some amusement and didn't give much credence to tall tales of the road, its hazard lights on, thinking it must be someone having car trouble. I pulled up behind it slowly and stopped to see if they needed help. When I got close to the car, everything appeared to be in order except for the fact that it was covered in mud and debris, almost like it had been driven through a swamp. I cautiously looked through one of the windows and noticed a young couple hunched over in their seats, clearly shaken, and they muttered to themselves, "Hey there." I called up tentatively, so as not to startle them. "Is everything okay? I need some help." The woman looked up at me, in fear at first, but then relief came over her face when she realized that I wasn't a potential threat. She rolled down the window quickly and explained, her hands shaking, that they had been attacked by something they couldn't quite understand. Her partner, who was still pale and having trouble speaking, finally added that they had seen a figure in the distance, while driving down a dimly lit road. It was tall, thin, and strangely distorted with elongated limbs, like something from a nightmare. He described how it had lunged at their car and sent them swerving into the ditch, and my skepticism started to wane as I, taking into account their sincere fear and complete confusion, I told them that we would get assistance and let them wait in my truck until the police arrived. While we waited, conversations between two different officers that I overheard on the radio revealed that there was more to this anomaly than I initially believed. Intrigued by the bizarre events taking place in front of me, I became more cautious when driving through that area going forward. A few weeks later, at another truck stop, I repeated this advice. As dusk descended and shadows danced between tree trunks along the road, I turned my attention to an unusually high level and saw it move just beyond my headlights. Dark shapes were shifting through the twilight stem embrace as the hushed conversations continued about the elusive attacker or whatever it was that had frightened those who had been attacked earlier. A mixture of curiosity and fear drove me to instinctively reach for my pocket knife and fling open my driver's side door as the eerie figure approached with an unnatural gait that sent shivers down my spine. The creature lunged at me with lightning speed, and I barely had time to react before narrowly avoiding its outstretched claws by ducking. When the monster's talons scraped against the metal, leaving deep gashes in its wake, I quickly scrambled back into my truck and slammed the door shut behind me. This creature was faster than any human, and I knew I wouldn't be able to hold my own against it. My hands raced over the dashboard in a desperate attempt to find anything that could help repel this hungry monster. Sightings of a strange beast that is said to lurk in these very woods have been steadily increasing over the past few days, leading to a full-blown panic in the surrounding villages. As fear runs through my veins, a stroke of luck comes my way. The truck's radio crackles to life once more, announcing an urgent message for all drivers in the area. The voice on the radio claimed that although this creature lived deep in the forest, it would stalk and attack anyone who trespassed on its territory, which seemed to include portions of my trucking route. The locals had come to refer to it as the Silent Stalker. The broadcast continued by describing the Silent Stalker's weakness, which was its intensely bright light. The creature hissed and recovered like a snake caught in sunlight in its spasms of pain and rage. I saw my chance shaking with adrenaline, so I changed gears and sped down the road as fast as my truck could manage. I could hear a Silent Stalker growling in the distance. If nothing else, I switched on my high beams immediately. The gravity of my near-death experience hit me hard at that moment, and I took deep breaths to calm still racing heart. In the end, I discovered that the Silent Stalker had been hiding in the shadows of these woods for generations. I did not slow down to a more reasonable speed until I was certain that I had put enough distance between myself and the Silent Stalker. It was probably once a respected member of those communities, tucked away at the edge of the forest, living in peaceful symbiosis with its surroundings until its habitat was compromised. I shared my story and some facts. Unchecked human expansion into its territory and ruthless deforestation had made it more desperate, territorial, and aggressive. The government eventually intervened and declared parts of the forest as a wildlife refuge with the goal of giving Silent Stalkers enough space to remain happy and away from humans. Although initially people were a little dubious, they quickly came to understand that by respecting Silent Stalkers' territory, they would be able to prevent at least one other driver from having a similar experience. As time went on, I learned more about this mysterious creature, filling countless notebooks with everything I knew from folklore eyewitness accounts and my own terrifying experiences. Silent Stalkers also became somewhat of a deterrent for legal industry activities within the protected zone, which seemed to be the only viable solution for both parties. Experiences that are still haunted by that chilly night as my rigs rumbled down desolate roads that were engulfed by the gloom. I couldn't help but be constantly on the lookout for any movement or odd shadows beyond my headlights, but the silent stalker disappeared into obscurity once more. There is always a mystery hidden among those tall trees, but even though its existence serves as a reminder of our frailty in the hidden depths of nature, those ancient forests managed to keep their secrets. It was a hot summer afternoon as I sat in my truck taking a much-needed break. The heat wave had been relentless, and my partner Lane Dorsey and I had been transporting goods across the nation 4 days. In appreciation, I always kept in mind the unwritten rules within silent stalkers' territory. We were somewhere in the vast expanse of when our truck's air conditioner failed. We were baking in our own perspiration in Texas. I recall making a joke that we probably smelled like roasted pork by the time we got there. Lane, wearing one of his many novelty hats, shot me in a music video. We stopped at a small gas station outside of Scranton Springs, a barely inhabited town. The area was a picture of desolation, with a few dilapidated houses and a diner that looked I didn't have a bad feeling about anything yet, just two exhausted truckers stopping for some food, and the diner itself seemed stuck in time. It had a gas station that somehow still had fuel despite its rusty pumps, so we filled up and used the restrooms before choosing to have some food at the desolate diner. As Lane and I slid into a booth that creaked under our weight, I noticed another customer sitting hunched over at the counter, his long hair hiding his face, but it was covered in an almost tangible layer of grease from decades ago. An elderly couple was sitting at one of the booths, their fragile hands wrapped around mugs of steaming coffee, completely ignoring our entrance. He was clearly carrying a lot of emotional and possibly physical baggage, so we ordered what passed for food from an equally ancient waitress named Mabel. Despite our low expectations, the greasy burger I bit into tasted like heaven after days of eating crackers and jerky, and as we were eating ravenously, I couldn't help but hear the elderly couple's conversational snippets, which the locals took my curiosity was piqued by calling the whisperer, so I leaned a little closer to listen. This was a bad idea, because the room fell silent as everyone's attention was drawn to me. The old man gave me a steely look, and the tension in the room suddenly increased. If you fell for a saint from Scranton Springs, it's best you don't get involved in our business, he warned. After we finished our meals, we said goodbye to Mabel and headed back to our truck. Before I could even stutter an apology, Lane interrupted with his trademark diplomatic style, saying, "Sorry about that, sir. My buddy here is just curious about everything." He then slapped me on the back and let out a hearty laugh that broke up the dense fog of tension, smoke swirling in the air. As we climbed into the stuffy cab and got ready to drive again, Lane looked at me and said, "You didn't ask for it, but here are some words of wisdom. Eavesdropping has its own price." I nodded and sighed, my curiosity stifled by his advice, and we left Scranton Springs without saying anything more about the whisperer. With my heart racing, I drove as carefully as I could down the narrow dirt road. We'll find the main road again soon. About 30 minutes later, we noticed a gnarled, hollowed-out oak tree with a hive of activity in its hollow trunk. Our massive rig Lane looked at me with ease, his weathered face etched with exhaustion and worrying. He insisted that we turn back, saying in a strained voice, "I have no choice in that matter." I forced my grip to relax on the wheel. We both felt uneasy when we saw a group of crows perched in the branches above, but we dismissed it as the result of our weary minds playing tricks. A short while later, out of curiosity or foolishness, we discovered an old, dilapidated farmhouse that appeared to have been abandoned long ago. We chose to investigate further, and moonlight lit the path leading to the front door creaked open. As we cautiously entered the house, pulling out our flashlights, and looked around the rundown room in front of us. Dusty papers covered nearly every surface, and vines had twisted their way through broken windows up to the house. The tall grass swayed in the gentle wind, casting long shadows. Found a once hidden door that led to a basement that smelled of decay and evil intent. Disregarding our better judgment, we went down into the dark, our flashlights flickering over long-forgotten medical equipment and strange symbols drawn on stone walls. In one corner, there was an altar with flickering candles and dying flowers. The longer we were underground, the more uneasy we became, especially when we were well past the point of safety or reason. So when Lane pointed out a partially burned photo surrounded by dozens of white candles, which illuminated not just one face but three that looked like us in some unsettling way, fear gripped my chest like a vice. We ran back upstairs and out the door with our hearts in our throats, never looking back, and eventually arrived at our destination a day late at night. Stories of what we'd seen were shared between us during the few. Lane was so horrified that he asked a friend to dig up the truth about that damned farmhouse during some downtime on the road. The information his friend revealed rocked us to our core. According to local legend, the house belonged to Dr. Nathaniel Blackwood, who was accused of performing horrifying experiments on his own children in the early 1900s. I heard that name before Lane whispered it, while wiping a bead of when the whisperer mentioned the mysterious entity we had heard about in Scranton Springs. Even though it was in broad daylight and miles away from the horrors we had experienced, we couldn't help but laugh uneasily, perhaps out of disbelief or perhaps just an effort to forget what we had been through. Nevertheless, my thoughts kept returning to that horrifying basement and that eerie altar decorated with dying flowers, with flickering candles and pictures that looked too much like us. Dr. Nathaniel Blackwood, the Whisperer, was viewed as both tragic and monstrous by some. However, during those gloomy hours when fear gripped me and wouldn't let go, I knew deep down that no matter how far we'd come from that evil place, its sinister hold would never fully let us go as we drove through unexplored towns. And even though neither Lane nor I discussed it out loud again, following the disturbing revelations of that day, I knew that every new cockroach scream above acted as a warning bell, reminding us that evil never dies in a single place. The world is always looking for tired travelers like us to share its twisted secrets with. It was a typical hot and dry afternoon in Arizona, and I was sitting in my truck parked at a rest stop eating a sandwich I had just picked up from the gas station. I joked to myself that this was probably the driest sandwich I had ever eaten, but at least it wasn't one of those cow monstrosities. My name is Dane Corvines, and I've been driving trucks. As I was finishing my lunch, I noticed someone pull up next to my truck. It was an old, beat-up minivan with chick paint, and a tall, gaunt man with greasy hair that hung down to his shoulders stepped out. He was wearing soiled khaki cargo pants and what must have been a white shirt. The stranger fumbled around in his van for a minute before he pulled out something large and covered in a tarp. I have been walking on the road for years, with that charming mixture of curiosity and boredom that comes from hours on the road alone. I couldn't help but watch him through my rearview mirror as he walked over to use the rest stop bathroom. I assumed it was just junk he needed to dig through before finding whatever he was looking for, maybe tools or jumper cables. When he did, I caught a glimpse of his hands and lower face were covered in horrifying blood. Panic struck as he quickly fled to his van in a desperate attempt to wash himself clean. My thoughts were racing with potential outcomes. Was he hurt? Did he accidentally kill someone? Or worse? I knew there was no way it would ignore what I had seen, so I grabbed the baseball bat from behind my seat and carefully walked over to the man's van to avoid drawing his attention to myself. As I got closer, I saw that the van's side was covered in blood. The man was now frantically trying to fit the large tarp-covered object back into his vehicle, and from this angle, I could see that it was a human figure, a woman, and a feeling of horror overcame me as he started to. I picked up a nearby rock and threw it at his windshield, causing him to drop the tarp and reveal the body in full, more gruesome than I could have imagined, bruised, bloody, and disfigured. All doubts in my mind vanished as I wrestled with her body, stuffing it cruelly into the small space before slamming the door shut. Pure adrenaline kicked in. With murder in his eyes, the man turned to face me, and we stared at each other for what felt like an eternity. He was considering his options, and I was wondering if it was even possible to beat this man senselessly. My blood ran cold as he dashed back into his van and pulled out a gun. But just then, fate stepped in, and the state trooper pulled into the rest stop behind us. The antagonist's icy stare transformed into he decided in a moment to abandon his gory cargo and flee the scene with squealing tires as the sirens sounded and lights flashed behind him. I dropped my bat in shock as the trooper came to question me. In a daze of adrenaline and shock, I recounted my terrifying experience, barely able to comprehend what had just transpired. Days after the horrific incident was I met up with some friends who had heard about it on the local news, and they found out about a serial killer who fit the description and had been active in the area for a while. It turns out that Walter Duffy was the man. After all these years and thousands of miles of driving, I never imagined that something so horrifying would happen right in front of me. Isn't just for finding good sandwiches. Sometimes it can help bring a monster to justice. After I gave the trooper my statement, the following few days were filled with interviews, local news stories, and endless conversations. It was surreal to think that I had actually met serial killer Walter Duffy. His name kept repeating in my head, with icy, murderous eyes. I made the decision to learn more about him. It turns out that he had disappeared from his hometown years prior. He had been a modest, quiet man who kept to himself most of the time. But one day he simply disappeared, leaving behind an unsolved, sinister mystery that he had created. The days that followed the incident went by. The image of that poor woman's bloodied body kept coming back to me in nightmares, and my paranoia took over. I tried to avoid rest periods and keep myself busy with work and the investigation, and the news eventually reported that the bodies of several other victims had been found because of the information I gave the authorities, preventing innocent people from suffering at the hands of Walter Duffy. But Walter himself continued to elude capture. Then, one day, as I was traveling through a small town close to Flagstaff, Arizona, I stopped at a gas station for some cigarettes and lottery tickets, which are my usual long-distance vices. As I was leaving the gas station, I saw a man across the street who appeared to be uninterested in his surroundings, but was closely watching me. He had a dirty beard, sunglasses, and a brown baseball cap low on his forehead. He was just another drifter traveling through a tired town. But something about him bothered me. My gut instinct returned, so I quickly got back in my truck and drove away from the gas station when I noticed the stranger swiftly scuttling into an alleyway in my side mirror, seemingly attempting to blend in. I made the risky decision to confront this guy right then and there because it was the only way to put an end to all of my paranoia and uneasiness. Without hesitation, I parked my truck in a nearby alley and walked back nervously, holding onto my reliable baseball bat. As I turned the corner, I saw him standing by a dumpster with his arms crossed. My heart started to race with my racing thoughts. I thought you were clever because he called out to me before I could even raise my bat. And he recognized me too. "What do you want?" I asked, still holding on to the hope that perhaps this was just some strange and terrible coincidence. "But you ruined everything," he spat out, reaching into his coat to the trooper who had aided me days earlier, was running towards us with his weapon drawn and backup on their way when Walter Duffy pulled out a gun. Before he could even point it at me, shouts from the area caught our attention. Walter turned back to face me, and there was something in his face that almost seemed like a request for assistance, possibly so that someone else would understand why he had turned into this twisted monster. Without saying another word, he raised the gun. Walter Duffy's sick legacy ended abruptly with that gunshot ringing in my ears forevermore. I was driving down the highway in my 18-wheeler, feeling pretty good about life, having just gotten a great deal on a few video games and action figures at a flea market. I had come to his temple, realizing he couldn't escape, but refusing to surrender. And suddenly I'm Harvey Delford, and I've been in the trucking industry for more than 20 years. As you can probably imagine, I've seen some strange things on the road, but nothing could have prepared me for what was about to happen. As I approached a small town in Wyoming called Red Bow, I noticed construction. The weather was perfect, sunny and cool. I took the detour route that led through the center of town, seeing signs ahead indicating that my usual shortcut was closed. I complained about the inconvenience and thought it was a typical rural community with a few local businesses and an eerie quietness that came from years of being off the beaten path. Little did I know what was hiding just beneath the surface of this sleepy town. When I saw a group of teenagers hanging out near an old, abandoned building while driving through town, they immediately turned their attention to my truck. At first, it seemed like just some bored kids playing with a big rig driver, making jokes and making fun of them over a CB radio. But, as you know, things started to get really strange when, with a mixture of disgust and worrying for their safety, I called the local authorities via my CB radio to report what had happened after spotting one of the teenagers take out what appeared to be a hypodermic needle full of red liquid from his backpack. He injected himself with it right there on the sidewalk, convulsing violently before passing out. The others pulled him into an alley and vanished from view. We've been having some problems lately with a dangerous drug circulating among the youth in town. We're trying to get it under control, but it's difficult when suppliers keep changing, Mr. Delford said after taking down my account of what happened. We were out of sight, of course, but a few minutes later I was met by a police car and an officer named Deputy Dustin Shepherd. Thank you for bringing this to our attention, Mr. Delford. The gut-wrenching feeling that something more sinister was happening in Red Bow persisted as I drove through The recent Red Bow incident was still fresh in my mind, so I decided to do some research on my own. Elusive rumors led me back to Red Bow a week later, and I heard other drivers discussing strange occurrences in rural towns across the country, including sightings of people with human strength and an unnatural addiction to violence. That night, I was using crystal meth or opiates at a truck stop diner outside of Cheyenne. I know vigilante justice seekers and investigative journalists, but I've always been more concerned with getting from point A to point B safely than wondering if there was something sinister going on behind closed doors. This operation was run by strange people who experimented on young men and women using mysterious substances from an unknown source that turned those who came into contact with them into unrecognizable monsters. However, as I sit here in my truck cab outside of Red Ballet nightfall, getting ready to explore the darkness in this town, whether it's misguided teenagers making a nightmare-inducing cocktail or a covert cult producing terrifying monsters, I can't help but feel that someone needs to look deeper and expose this madness. Perhaps that someone is me. Harvey Delford is a truck driver who I pulled my truck closer into Red Bow and found a discreet parking spot after having an unexpected encounter with something he can't forget. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw someone entering the same abandoned building where I'd seen those teenagers earlier. After some hesitation, I decided to investigate, and I quietly got out of my 18-wheeler and made my way toward the building. Shadows loomed over broken windows and abandoned furniture, and it soon became clear that this place had been transformed into a makeshift laboratory with vials, syringes, and beakers scattered about. A man in his 40s or 50s wearing a filthy outfit. The atmosphere was heavy with tension, making me shiver despite the warm night, and the smell of dampness and mold filled my nostrils as I entered through a cracked doorway. I was about to say the same to you, but I countered, "Who are you and what's going on in this place?" He sighed heavily and rubbed his temples. "You shouldn't be here," he said abruptly, his voice barely audible, standing hunched over a table and concentrating on a menacing swirl of liquid inside a glass container. I pressed for an explanation, and he looked into my eyes before grudgingly confessing, "I've been researching an experimental compound that would enhance human abilities like strength, agility, healing, and even survival instincts, like what happened to that kid on the street." He began as if his name alone could explain everything I asked angrily. Yes, and he admitted shamefully. But it wasn't supposed to be like this. He explained that local criminals had stolen his work and were distributing the drug around Red Bow by changing its formula and adding highly addictive ingredients that turned it into a monstrous substance in an attempt to profit from its effects. After he said this, I heard a heartbreaking sob from a corner. I could just make out the shape of a woman strapped to a chair, probably one of his collateral damages. What are you going to do now? I asked, horrified at what Drive had done. Westerland had been trying in secret to create an antidote that would reverse the damage, but each attempt only made matters worse because of Westerland's ambition. I don't know, he sighed deeply as his words lingered in the air like poison gas. Determined to put an end to this nightmare, I took matters into my own hands and called Deputy Shepherd again with all the information I had learned. Within hours, authorities surrounded Drive Westerland's lair and took him into custody, although authorities promised to crack down on the criminal organization that was distributing the drug, which they now called Red Wrath. I couldn't get the memory of Red Bow's suffering out of my head. I made it my personal mission to make sure that it didn't spread beyond Red Bow, because it seemed appropriate that the person who had discovered it by accident, an ordinary truck driver named Harvey Delford, should bear the responsibility. I knew that no matter where I went from now on, my life would never be the same again. As I left Red Bow behind, for what I hoped would be the last time, its eerie atmosphere served as a reminder that sometimes fate places you in certain places for a reason, even if you discover them by taking a detour down an unexpected road. The absurdity of life always hits you in the face. The face with all the grace of a sledgehammer. Okay. Imagine this. I'm sitting in a dilapidated truck stop diner in the middle of Nowsville, USA, trying to enjoy my fourth cup of disgustingly bitter coffee while ignoring the fact that my favorite trucker hat is worn grease, which is keeping from falling apart. You would think that this was as bad as life could get right now. But boy, was I about to be proven wrong. I then talked to Alvin, another truck driver, about last night's game. We were in the middle of a heated argument when we were interrupted by what could only be described as the embodiment of chaos itself, at least in human form. A woman with a rugged appearance stumbled into the diner, her movements erratic and unpredictable, her clothes practically torn, and her hair wild and matted with blood and dirt. Her eyes, she screamed weakly for help before collapsing to the ground, and we all rushed to her side as someone dialed 911. While we waited for help to arrive, she barely managed to mutter something about an attack and a twisted man who seemed more like a monster than a human. The ambulance arrived in a matter of minutes, but it felt like hours, and they took the woman away with a stretcher. Alvin and I, still shaken by what we saw and heard from that woman, decided it was time to go out on the road again separately. This time, I adjusted my trusty hat on my head, despite its pathetic condition, got into my rig, and drove down the road, unable to get rid of the horrifying image. We all stared numbly at the red and blue flashing lights as they sped off into the dusk. During a rather unsettling section of deserted highway, I noticed another rig driving behind me. There was something almost predatory about its headlights, glaring at me from the rearview mirror. Word of that poor woman's attack spread like wildfire throughout the trucking community. I tried to ignore it as I continued my route, but it seemed impossible. A creeping sense of unease started to wash over me as I thought about the possibility that the rig kept an uncomfortable distance as we sped down the seemingly endless highway, and I started jumping at shadows and flinching at every unexpected sound like an over-caffeinated rabbit. Perhaps this driver wasn't just some rig hauler like me, and perhaps this was the twisted man that the woman had warned us about before she passed away from her injuries. Then, as I reached for another stale cup of coffee in my small cab, fate couldn't decide whether it had had enough of kicking me around. I looked up to see the unimaginable happen. The rig behind me accelerated, smashing into my back end and almost toppling my own ray gun to its side. My heart raced with a mix of fear and rage. I struggled to keep the truck under control and keep it in one piece. Peace on the pavement. Who would do such a thing? Was this reality? As we continued to speed down the highway, our truck socked in a twisted dance, and my body jumped with excitement. The stakes were higher than ever. It was a game of death, and I had no idea if I would survive. The mysterious truck behind me repeatedly attempted to rip into my rig, probably hoping to see me crash or buckle under his onslaught. But this uneasy embrace between our vehicles left no space for comprehension or answers, only the vicious and nearly animalistic will to live. I tried everything I could to break free from the vampire's hold behind me, but ultimately it didn't matter if I succeeded or failed. The constant struggle between our trucks was still going on, and my mind kept wandering to with my heart pounding. I realized I couldn't outrun this twisted man forever, so I took a chance and slammed on my brakes, jolting the car as my surroundings blur into a whirlwind of chaos and adrenaline. Only one thing is crystal clear. This twisted man must be stopped before he claims his next victim. I took a deep breath, called 911, and explained the situation to the trucker behind me. I heard sirens in the distance, so I stepped out of my rig and felt like I was entering the lion's den. The other driver stepped out too, and I got shivers down my spine. He had dead eyes and a scar down his cheek. He lit a cigarette, took a drag, and smirked at me. "What's wrong?" I asked. "Can't you handle a little rough play on the road?" He teasingly asked. "Who are you? Why are you doing this?" He flicked away his cigarette and walked slowly toward me, introducing himself as Eddie Daniels, but most people just call me Nightmare Eddie. You see, I enjoy playing games. It's what keeps me going. Eddie relished in the fear of other people. It was almost like an addiction for him. The police came just in time to stop him, guns drawn, and shouted for him to get on the ground with his hands up in surrender. As the sirens got louder, he kept talking, saying, "You think you're different, you're not special." And then Eddie sneered, "Just another nobody in my playhouse." Before being taken into custody, Eddie gave me a wink. While sitting in the back seat of the police car, an officer explained that Eddie was famous for frightening truckers across the nation. He was known as Nightmare Eddie by those who had met him on desolate highways and nights. For years, truck drivers had been hearing terrifying tales about him. A few days later, I learned that Eddie was responsible for a number of recent heinous killings involving truck drivers, including the mutilated woman from the diner. But justice won out and Eddie was imprisoned. As I pulled my old, worn-out trucker hat down over my brow and settled into a new day's drive, I couldn't get rid of the eerie feeling that Eddie's twisted games wouldn't end with his incarceration. From that point on, whenever I hit the road, I couldn't help but think of Nightmare Eddie and how fortunate I was to have escaped his grasp. It was an unusually warm afternoon in February, so I decided to take advantage of some as a trucker. For more than 20 years, I'd been all over these areas, but this one seemed oddly unfamiliar. My name is Braxton O'Malley, and I was born and raised in Houston, Texas. In my spare time between trucking gigs, I parked my rig at the edge of a small town in northeastern Montana. Let's call it Redwood Valley Hell. But don't let the locals fool you after 20 years of traveling and too many failed relationships to count. This Irish redneck is more adept at getting himself into trouble than anything else. You could say that I'm a magnet for dubious activity. As I walked down Main Street in search of a local bar to switch up my typical fast food combo meal, I couldn't get rid of the uneasy feeling. Regarding this small town, the few people on the sidewalks appeared disinterested, almost lethargic, which could be dismissed as small-town boredom, but something about their expressionless looks unnerved me. "Hey there, buddy," said an elderly man who appeared to be carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. "You seem lost." I smiled and said, "I'm just looking for a good place to grab a beer." "Look no further than Mac's Pub on your—" He pointed to what must have been the town's oldest building on the left. Entering Mac's Pub was like traveling back in time, with vintage bar stools, dim lighting from flickering bulbs above, and even an antique jukebox tucked away in a corner playing classic rock songs. A few shabby guys were drinking whiskey at the counter and talking slowly with Mac, I sat down at the bar next to them and ordered a cold beer. As they talked about delayed crops and their struggles to keep their businesses afloat, I started to feel more at ease, because these people were just small-town farmers dealing with their daily problems. A young girl walked in front of her face streaked with tears, attracting everyone's attention. She was shaking and obviously distressed, and Mac hurried to her side right away. I went to the old summer to get some tools, but all I found was his truck and blood. The room froze, as if everyone there knew exactly what had happened, but didn't want to acknowledge it. "What's wrong? My dad's gone," she sobbed. "He went to the old summer earlier to pick up some tools, and he hasn't come back," I asked him, cautiously, and he looked me in the eye and explained that this town has been plagued by unexplained disappearances for years, and every time someone goes missing, they're being last seen near the old sawmill. We already know what happened. Hand on the bar suddenly became more alert than lethargic as before he yelled, "Damn it," his voice shaking. I asked him more questions, and he leaned closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "We've never seen who or what is behind these horrific events, but we have discovered mangled remains a few times, twisted limbs torn asunder like tossed rag dolls." I searched my mind for answers, but couldn't find any. Was it some insane person preying on gullible townspeople? I hesitated for a moment, but my instincts told me that if there was ever a time to put my rough exterior to good use, this was it. With determination and a lead-filled fist, I gave chase to the terror-gripping hands. Or perhaps something more sinister, before any conclusions could be drawn. An ear-piercing scream echoed outside the pub. We burst out into the street just in time to see another resident being dragged around a corner by what appeared to be misshapen grotesque hands. As abruptly as the onslaught had started, it was over, and a chilly silence descended upon us like a shroud. I stared into the darkness, my heart thumping in my chest as a shiver ran down my spine. Redwood Valley was blindly following an unknown beast into the depths of darkness, but whatever this monstrosity was, it seemed determined to avoid capture at all costs, determined to continue its reign of terror. As I rounded the corner, my eyes straining to get a glimpse of whatever was frightening these people, I heard a faint whimpering in an alleyway, and there, hidden within the shadows, was an elderly man who was obviously injured and clinging to life. His clothes were tattered and stained with blood. I knew I had to face this horror before it destroyed Redwood Valley. I approached him carefully, my fists clenched, prepared for whatever might happen next. I asked, kneeling next to him. The old man's gassy face made me uneasy. He struggled to speak through shallow breaths, and only managed to say 2 words. The Miller name, which has plagued this town since its founding, filled me with fear. An old man named Miller, a prosperous businessman from the previous century, lost his family in the fire that destroyed the old sawmill. According to legend, he never recovered from his grief and one day broke down, promising to help others feel his pain despite his injuries. The old man passed away in my arms, and I assured him that I would end this nightmare and that the Miller wouldn't claim any more victims. So I spoke with some locals who advised looking for clues close to the old, burned-out sawmill itself. When night fell again, I found myself standing at the edge of the crumbling property, its charred timbers casting eerie shadows on everything they touched. I went inside what was left of the sawmill and looked everywhere for any sign of what was happening with the Miller's gory phantom among the rubble and rotting ash. My great-grandfather had been business partners with old Miller himself, and it turned out that it was the greed of those early days and the subsequent betrayal between the Millers and my own family that led to the discovery of a piece bearing the crest of the O'Reilly Miller Lumber Company among the shattered remnants of burned papers, old orders, and client records from when the mill was operating. The only way to break this curse might be to confront the Miller directly. A gutter growl reverberated through the abandoned sawmill, sending a shock of terror through my spine. From a nearby pile of rubble, a twisted, distorted figure emerged. This was the bloodline that caused a misery that befell every generation, since anger and regret washed over me. These people were suffering because of my family's wrongdoings. I barely avoided the miller's attack and fought back with every ounce of strength I had, driven by the pain and suffering I had seen in this town. Somehow, in the middle of a lockdown battle, we both found ourselves briefly perched on the edge of what had once been a churning water wheel, now dry and swollen. The old man miller's mangled body was a testament to years of grief and rage. I returned to Redwood Valley broken, but determined not to let my past define me. As I paid my respects to that makeshift grave, lifeless, I looked into the miller's tortured eyes and apologized for everything that had happened between our families. Surrounded by his own decay, he seemed to understand. With one last agonized scream, the miller let go of me and fell into the dark abyss below. Memorials for those who perished in this tragedy, and I promised that my family would never again cause pain to these decent people. I decided to take a different route than live on the road, and I moved to Redwood Valley today. The people there are helping them rebuild their town and mend their lives. And as the years went by and I started to establish myself in this small town that had given me redemption, I could never completely purge it was a terrible day at work. I remember it being extremely hot, and our boss had just informed us that we would be working overtime to handle some unforeseen shipments. As a truck driver, I had grown accustomed to working late hours on long hauls, but in helping others, I found a purpose and my salvation. The curse was broken, and we won. I've been driving trucks for more than 10 years, have a wife, 2 children, and some financial responsibilities. I'm just your average Joe, but we managed to make it work despite everything. There was something about that day that just didn't sit right with me. It's funny how life throws curveballs at you like that. Sometimes little things seem to signal big changes. The route I was given that day took me through a relatively empty area of Nevada called Pancake Flat, which isn't really known for anything other than the desolation and what seems like an endless desert landscape. By the time I got out there, night had already fallen, and my half-empty cup of lukewarm coffee wasn't helping me stay upright. Truck driving has never been the most enjoyable job, but it pays the bills. I stopped at a small gas station for a cigarette break just before I hit the straight stretch of road where only sagebrush and darkness kept me company. It was then that I met Dave, another trucker, who started talking to me about how he had heard strange rumors from other drivers about this area and explained sightings near accidents. Typical truck stop chatter, and he laughed and shrugged. Despite my skepticism, we parted ways. Dave went back to the truck stop, and I got into my rig to finish the rest of my trip. As the miles passed on those lengthy, dark highways late at night, those conversations lingered in my mind. About an hour into my drive, fatigue seemed to hit me like a brick wall. My eyes became heavy, and I found it harder and harder to concentrate. Rode as I yawned and became more exhausted. I heard a sudden thump and felt the car shudder briefly, as if I had just struck something. I muttered, hurriedly pulled over, grabbed my flashlight, and then leapt out to check the damage. To my complete bewilderment, there was nothing that I could have hit or any damage, so I sighed and got back in my truck to continue my journey. But that's when things really started to get weird. Something caught my attention on the side of the road as I was driving through the seemingly endless darkness of Pancake Flat. It appeared to be a tall, thin person wearing tattered clothing with long, greasy hair hanging over their face. They were just standing there staring at me as I passed by. I was now wide awake and my heart was racing, so I gripped the steering wheel tightly. The hair stood up on the back of my neck. A voice in my head urged me to stop and assist this stranger, but my instincts told me to keep driving even though the person didn't look right and their posture gave the impression that they were waiting for something or someone. This unsettling feeling started to wash over me, as if someone was watching me from the shadows, convinced that what I had seen was real and not just a trick of my tired mind. Every mile seemed to be taunting me with a sense of impending doom, As I continued down the seemingly endless road, I laughed insecurely until I suddenly saw that they were again farther down the road. But this time they appeared to be the same person. But this time their head was tilted at an almost grotesquely unnatural angle. Panic struck me. How could this be possible? And more importantly, what did they want? With a racing heart, I continued to drive in the hopes that I wouldn't see the figure again. But it was once more emerging out of the shadows, even more terrifying than before. I had a lot of questions, but I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't stop. As the tension in the truck increased and a sense of dread descended upon me, regardless of what secrets the pancake flat held, I had to find out who or what it was, and stop it. Gathering all my courage, I slammed on the brakes and jumped out of the truck. "Who are you? What do you want?" I demanded. At first, the figure said nothing, but eventually they spoke in a gutter. Before the twisted face stared at me, my hands were shaking uncontrollably as I gripped the wheel. Whisper I was barely able to hear Riley Merwin. "Who's Riley Merwin?" I snapped back. "You don't know her." The figure responded. "You don't know her." I was breathing heavily, and my rage was getting stronger by the second. I went straight to the figure and asked, "Why are you doing this? Why are you following me?" It hesitated, then dropped its head in desperation. "I'm not really here to hurt you," it said slowly. "I just need your help." I was so shocked that I could feel my fear leaving me as curiosity took its place. I asked hesitantly, and the figure reluctantly revealed that they were Riley Merwin, a missing person who had been forced into hiding after witnessing a horrific crime involving the dangerous drug syndicate a few days earlier. Every word Riley spoke changed her into a young woman whose face matched her voice, desperate and afraid. "I've been trying to get help, and I tried flagging down other truckers before you, but based on their responses, they might be connected to the syndicate." The greasy hair and tattered clothes were just part of a disguise to stay under the radar in this desolate area. When things started to make sense, we called the police and reported the crime Riley Merwin had witnessed to the authorities. I let her ride with me until we arrived at a safe place where she could come forward about the drug syndicate. And for me, it was all dark and lonely. That's why I've been following you. I felt both desperate and like I could trust you for some reason. Road through Pancake Flat now evokes strong memories of Riley Merwin, not as a terrifying dream, but as a reminder that even in the most sinister and darkest aspects of life, there are still people trapped there who require assistance, atonement, or just a chance to get away. I never saw Riley again after she made it out safely, but the experience profoundly altered my perspective on life. I was a truck driver named Leon Whitaker, and I can guarantee you that you'd be hard-pressed to find someone else with that name. Anyway, I'd made a quick stop at a truck stop on a particularly hot summer afternoon, and it all began with that enigmatic figure I couldn't forget lurking in the shadows, just waiting for someone to give her a chance. Well-known gas station, just outside of Eureka Springs, Arkansas. As I was getting my usual greasy egg sandwich and black coffee from the diner counter, I heard an elderly man murmuring something under his breath. At first, I thought it was just normal small talk in these kinds of places, but you should know that up until that point, I had never really been frightened by, call me cynical or skeptical if you want, but life on the road has taught me that reality can be far stranger than fiction. So you can imagine my surprise when this seemingly unimportant conversation took an unexpectedly dangerous turn. "Well, if it's not good old Leon," drew Tom Whaley, a fellow trucker, who liked to, "We both know we have miles to travel before we can rest." So I responded with an exaggerated eye roll. We were just finishing our meal and talking about some random trucker stuff, routes and roads, when the old man's faint mumbling grew louder and more intense. He talked way more than anyone should on any topic that came to mind. "Funny seeing you here in this god-forsaken place." Funny as it may be, Tom looked at me as I was deeply troubled by the strange statement that sounded like it was taken from a campfire ghost story. Despite my skepticism, I couldn't help but feel a slight prickle of curiosity and unease. Don't go down that lonely road past Thompson Farm after sundown, because there's something that lurks, there's something that doesn't take kindly to intruders in its territory, Tom said. What are you talking about, old man? Tom asked. Not one. To hold his tongue, when the old man finished telling his unsettling story, there was a loud crash at the diner's entrance. We looked over and saw a young woman. The old man paused for a few seconds before leaning in and whispering, I've seen it, some kind of thing pacing the land like it owns the place. It has dark eyes, the coldest I've ever seen, and its grin, dear Lord, I can never forget that horrific grin. There's a body on Thompson Road, she gasped in terror as she frantically rushed through the door, her face pale with fear. This time, chills ran down our spines, and I exchanged pale looks before automatically getting up from our seats to assist with whatever horrible situation we'd unintentionally entered, risking whatever danger lay ahead. The mutilated body of what appeared to be an unfortunate driver or hiker was lying there, and his lifeless eyes stared blankly into oblivion as his body seemed almost torn to pieces with frenzied precision. I told you, the old man wailed as he hobbled towards us. I followed her through the winding road until we arrived at the gory scene, which made my blood run cold and blocked any previous thoughts of skepticism. As we stood looking at this macabre scene, considering the old man's cryptic warnings and wondering what sinister force might be hiding nearby, my cynicism began to wane. Yeah, Tom whispered, placing his hand on my shoulder. Perhaps we should listen to the old man, Leon. But none of you listen. As the sun sets on the innumerable highways I've driven down, I can't help but shiver at the thought of what inhuman entity might be waiting and watching for its next victim on that lonely stretch of road past Thompson Farm. With a heavy heart and a creeping sense of dread, I couldn't help but agree with him. We decided to heed the old man's words, ending our journey that day and leaving that tainted road behind. As we left that terrifying scene behind, I couldn't get rid of the feeling that we were being watched. Tom and I went back to our trucks and decided to spend the night at a motel rather than try our luck on that cursed road. The next day, we cautiously returned to the Thompson Farm area during the day in the hopes of finding some answers. We knocked on a few doors in the area and asked anyone who would listen, as they knew anything about this creature that supposedly haunted the road. And finally, we found an elderly woman who lived nearby. It happened many years ago, and she started thinking back with bated breath about a man, Jeremiah Thompson, who lived nearby. No one knows what brought him here, but he began experimenting with dangerous things, dark rituals, and occult practices. As she spoke, her eyes grew far away, as though she could see everything happening just before her eyes were possessed by a malevolent spirit from ancient folklore that he had unintentionally summoned with his dark arts. Tom and I exchanged uncomfortable looks as the story progressed, wondering if this was the beginning of our gory antagonist. Without waiting for my answer, the old woman went on, and everyone feared him after that. People began going missing and being discovered dead, their bodies ripped apart like animals, tearing emblems from limbs, and some claim that this spirit still resides inside Jeremiah's decaying corpse, searching for more victims. They were darker than the depths of midnight, and that sinister grin was permanently stretched across his twisted visage. No one saw him in town anymore. Armed with these new revelations, Tom and I went back to the twisted scene of carnage from earlier. As soon as we arrived at the location where we had discovered the corpse, a dense fog covered us, seemingly protecting us from what we were looking for. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed something menacing hiding behind a twisted old tree. It slowly came to light, revealing a hideous Jeremiah Thompson. I seized Tom's arm and frantically urged him to back away quietly, but it was too late. The creature stared locked onto us, freezing us in place as it let out a blood-curdling shriek that pierced the darkness. It was a malevolent creature that appeared to be half human and half demon, with inky black eyes and a horrifying grin stretching across its disfigured face. Tom and I spent the time driving back to our trucks with Jeremiah's hideous form following closely behind. We barely made it to locking the doors before the creature's twisted hands clawed ferociously at the windows, splitting the air with its vicious snow as our engines roared to life. This silenced the sounds of nature around us and silenced the fog, driven by instinct to impure terror. Even though we barely survived that horrific encounter, Jeremiah Thompson is now an unhinged manifestation of evil. The knowledge of what lurked on Thompson Road haunted our dreams for a lifetime, but no one seemed interested in looking into it further or ending this demon's reign of terror. Perhaps there are some things that mortal hands cannot defeat, some mysteries that remain unsolved since years have gone by, and I have escaped the nightmare that almost took our lives on Thompson Farm Road. All we can do in this world is warn others about that dangerous stretch of road before anyone dies a horrible death at the hands of that ungodly beast. We don't discuss it much, but when dusk falls and an eerie stillness descends into the world's darkest corners, I know that we are both thinking about it. I was driving my truck on Route 66, the well-known highway that connects Chicago and Los Angeles, and it was getting late. I was considering finding a place to park for the night when my radio abruptly stopped working. Even now, I still shudder when I see those twisted old trees covered in a sinister curtain of fog. After being fired from my previous job at a warehouse, I picked up truck driving. The open road feels like home now, and my rig is called my sanctuary. I was frustrated and fumbled with the knobs trying to find a signal until a hazy voice finally broke through, saying something about a severe storm warning in the area. Just my luck. I drove down old county roads that had hardly been used in years in search of some place to stay the night, and as I did so, I couldn't help but notice how eerie and desolate the landscape had become. It felt like I was on a different planet, when dark clouds suddenly rolled overhead and fat raindrops started to spatter against my windshield. Within minutes, the rain was coming down in buckets, and visibility had decreased to nearly zero. Cursing the torrential downpour that was washing my windshield, I finally saw the dusty outline of a rundown gas station up ahead. Thinking it would be better than nothing, I pulled into one of the ramshackle covered bays and killed the engine. Just as I was about to fall asleep for the night, I noticed movement outside through sheets of rain. A figure with rags wrapped around them and hair plastered to their faces as they lumbered over to me, asking frantically, "You got any smokes?" barely audible over the unrelenting rain. I hesitated, but I threw them a pack out of sympathy, and they quickly thanked me before vanishing behind an abandoned building next to the station. Later that night, I was startled out of a restless sleep when the rain finally stopped. However, in eerie silence, which seemed to have engulfed the area, a chill of unease blossomed in my veins like ice. Then, I heard chilling screams echoing through the stillness, and I realized that the voice belonged to the disheveled person to whom I had given the cigarettes. I jumped out of my truck and hurried around the building, almost slipping on the wet gravel, when I saw a horrifying scene. As I stood there paralyzed by terror, the stranger was being brutally mauled, their bodies convulsing as an unnaturally large, grotesque figure ravaged them with violent intent. Blood and gore were painted on the walls and the ground of the makeshift alley, and pieces of tattered rags were scattered among the brutality. The figure smiled, daring me to do something with the feral intelligence shining in its half-beast, half-human eyes. Finally finding my voice, I yelled at it to stop it from laughing so loudly before it dropped its mangled prey and turned its attention toward me. Pushing me forward toward what felt like certain death, I soon realized that the creature seemed unaffected by my presence, almost amused that I believed I could stop its malicious game. "Who are you?" The fiend just stared back at me with a sly smile plastered across its blood-soaked visage. I screamed at it, feeling desperation and despair rise inside me as the gory scene ingrained itself in my mind's eye, bound to never be forgotten. Suddenly, I felt a sense of urgency and fear, certain doom bearing down on me like impending thunder, rolling through an otherwise peaceful summer sky. I was forced to follow my instincts, So I took a heavy wrench from my truck and charged the beast. As I got closer, I could make out more of its hideous features, including its razor-sharp claws, shocked teeth that glistened with blood, and scaly skin. It was around 10:27 p.m. when I was able to strike the beast in the head, and instead of recoiling, the beast just stared back at me apathetically. The creature gave me a chilling cackle and backed away, seemingly understanding my thoughts. Instead of giving chase or retaliating, it continued to laugh like a maniac before slithering into the darkness surrounding the gas station with trembling legs. As reality set in, my heart sank, mocking my pointless efforts. My eyes widened as I saw the face of a man in Henry Gaston, who had worked with me at that warehouse years prior. Henry was known for experimenting with occult rituals and looking for information about dark entities from banned books. I was feeling bad about not being able to save the stranger's mangled body. As I approached, suddenly, a gust of wind blew away some of the rags covering their faces. Panicking now, I recalled Henry talking about an ancient demon called Zeraphil, a shape-shifting beast of unfathomable power who demanded human sacrifices in exchange for granting dark wishes. If Sarah were to find me here, things would only get worse. I ran from the scene, determined to leave that abandoned place. The time on my dashboard read 11:43 p.m. and my truck roared violently down Route 66, frantically attempting to separate myself from this threat. I have been plagued by nightmares of ruthless violence and gory gore committed by that terrifying creature ever since. I never stayed in one spot. Instead, I was constantly moving in an attempt to break free from the clutches of terror that had imprisoned me, and on the third day after escaping that nightmare, I made the decision to confront my fears and look for answers. Even though I knew Henry had called upon Zeraphil and exchanged his own soul for demonic power, consumed by the beast he summoned, he was unable to resist its sadistic desires and ultimately suffered at the hands of his demon. I discovered this information in a dusty old book called The Best Area of Darkness while I was at a local library. It told me about the origins of the demon and the terrifying agreements made between it and its summoner. No matter where I go, my life has changed forever since that rainy night, and an eerie shadow hovers over me like a Zeraphil watches my every move, biting my time. Maybe it's waiting because I dared to confront it, or maybe it's hungry for another soul. For whatever reason, I continue to travel Route 66 alone, with memories that are filled with blood and horror. It was raining just enough to make the roads slick when I pulled over at the Pine Deck Inn. I beat up an old trucker stop that hardly made a dent in the vast Montana wilderness. I needed a break from transporting my 18-wheeler across the country, and this is one of the truths that endures despite my endless flight. There are some monsters we cannot escape. We cannot escape. This place provided the ideal escape, but I had no idea that it would be a night I would never forget. As soon as I entered, I felt both relief and disgust. Sure, it was good to be out of the rain, but the atmosphere wasn't particularly welcoming. The musty smell, the dim lighting, and the sticky floors weren't the best, but I've seen worse in my days on the road. I ordered a beer at the bar and took a seat on an uncomfortable stool to my left. An older man appeared to have been drinking whiskey 4 hours, and several other people were strewn about drinking as well, their faces probably trying to block out the long stretches of highway that were waiting for them. The evening passed without incident until I noticed the man making a commotion in one of the chairs. When he stumbled toward me, he slurred and sloppily put an arm around me. "Hello there. Have you heard about old Sickle Hands?" I replied cautiously, sipping my beer and hoping he'd move along soon. He was obviously drunk and seemed intent on preaching some sort of deranged sermon to anyone who would indulge him. Most people didn't pay any attention. The bartender glared at him from across the room, but he did nothing to stop him. The inebriated man leaned closer, and I could smell the alcohol on his breath. People who cross paths with Sickle Hands end up carved up like jack-o'-lanterns, he whispered, wearing a sinister grin. He's a walking nightmare with blades for fingers. His victims suffer slow, agonizing deaths, and some people say they've seen him lurking around here late at night. Throughout my years on the road, I'd heard my share of wild tales and unsupported campfire tales, so this one didn't really bother me. Instead of giving him any more attention, I graciously excused myself and made my way to the restroom as soon as I opened the door to step outside. Back outside, a glass shattered near the entrance, and as I turned around, I saw bloody cuts on a number of customers amid the broken glassware. No one knew where the attack originated or how it happened so quickly, and in that split second, chaos broke out, and people ducked under tables, running for their lives or, in some cases, fighting back with whatever makeshift weapon they could find. I watched in horror as a man with long black hair and disfigured hands came into view, preying on a wounded victim. It was clear that he was using sharp blades for his fingers. I realized that Sickle Hands were actually panicking and desperately looking for an escape route, so I ran toward the nearest exit, but I wasn't alone. My heart raced uncontrollably as I twisted through tables and chairs, trying to avoid the murderous man, and I squeaked past a group of people trying to hide behind the counter. Every time Sickle Hands lunged at someone or slashed the air, I felt my body tense up and my breath catch in my throat. He carried me relentlessly through pine decking, causing immense fear and indecision in my steps as others screamed and fought to avoid his brutal attacks. As the bloodshed continued, my desire to flee grew more desperate. Eventually, I arrived at the storage room near the back exit. In the dim light, I looked for anything that would help me defeat this terrifying attacker. After searching through boxes and crates, I found a shotgun on a shelf that looked like it might belong to the Pine Decan. Armed with newly discovered self-assurance, and I knew it was time to act. So I took aim at Sickle Hands' legs in a desperate attempt to immobilize him without killing him. With a shaky grip on the shotgun, I slipped back into the main room, where he was wreaking havoc and leaving destruction in his wake. Any illusions about the extent of human cruelty were irreversible as he approached a young woman cowering in a corner with tears streaming down her face. Before he could recover from my first blow, I fired again, this time aiming straight at his deformed hands, and somehow managed to hit true despite my trembling nerves and adrenaline pumping through me like hot iron coals. The gun roared to life, and Sickle Hands stumbled, letting out an earth-shattering growl that sent shivers down my spine. Following a storm, law enforcement officers hurried in, though someone must have made a call. While I was in the storage room, they captured Sickle Hands before he could do any more damage with his now severely damaged hands and led him toward one of their cars. The powerful blast and howls of pain filled the air as people started to emerge from their hiding places like timid creatures re-emerging after a storm had passed. They yelled outside Jeremiah's finger as though someone had really given them the man's name. It turned out that there was a strange familial connection between his grotesque transformation and his ancestry. It seems that his father had once carried out sinister experiments to improve the human body, which drove him insane due to his helplessness over his situation and his overwhelming guilt. The night at Pine Deck, which is still one of my darkest memories, shows how resilient the human spirit can be in even the most dire circumstances. Despite everything that happened, and the things I wish I could forget, Jeremiah Finger, who had been a murder machine since childhood due to family trauma, was unwittingly transformed into a monster by his own family. A small part of me, still drenched in cold sweat, thought that perhaps, after terrorizing others for so long, Jeremiah's Sickle Hands Finger found an ounce of peace. Deranged being known as Sickle Hands, I thought, maybe some lives were saved. That night, it was the first time I had the misfortune of meeting Sasha the Sadist, as I later nicknamed her. As a long-haul truck driver, I frequently encountered odd and occasionally unsettling characters on the road, but this one stood out. I'd stopped for a quick bite in a remote area of Nevada, and I had no idea that this pit stop would drastically alter the course of my life. It was a typical evening in terms of the weather. The diner I entered was your average small-town establishment, the type where residents ate their daily share of gossip, along with their eggs and bacon. I had just finished ordering myself some greasy food when Sasha entered, and her entrance attracted everyone's attention. The weather was clear and the temperature was cool enough to call for a light jacket, but not so cold that you would be shivering outside. Not because she was incredibly attractive or obviously dangerous, but rather because there was something about her presence that caused everyone to pause what they were doing for a moment. Sasha sat down at the bar and ordered herself a bourbon neat, as if it were a task on her to-do list. She spoke confidently and assertively to the bartender, and the evening continued without incident until when I got up to pay my bill in cash, I casually threw some tip money on the counter next to Sasha's drink. In my hurry to get out, I knocked over her glass and apologized, stammering as she narrowed her eyes at me and slid another folded bill in her direction. I muttered an apology before rushing out of there as fast as I could without actually running hours later down the desolate road. Of headlights sped up in my rearview mirror in real time, and I realized it was Sasha relentlessly pursuing me. Her car looked like mine, a big semi-truck not too far from the one I drove, and I hurried to call for assistance on the CB radio, begging anyone nearby to listen. A tiny voice broke through the static. Before I could communicate where I was, Sasha's truck crashed into my trailer, sending a shock of terror through me. Her ominous figure emerged in the side mirror, her eyes icy and unforgiving, and she motioned for me to slow down with her knife-wielding hand. My breath caught in my throat, and I was unable to pull over, so I pumped on the gas harder than ever before, whipping around curves and barely maintaining order as I tried to flee my dangerous assailant. Hope was restored when a group of truckers heard my distress call and joined forces to fight my unrelenting attacker Sasha. Despite being outnumbered, she seemed unfazed and continued to attack, and her truck's windows bore a menacing, bloody message. I could only watch helplessly as she ran, before swearing into the radio that the next time would be terrible for all of us who dared to stand in her way. One of the trucks in our convoy went off the road. We shared stories of how each of us had somehow harmed this as she retreated. Without ever recognizing it, I realized that the sadistic woman wasn't only regarding bothering Sasha. It was now clear that this insane person wanted something far more sinister from each of us in each place we visited. And there were rumors of more victims dropping at every gas station where we stopped at whispers. Pray to Sasha the sadist, but every new detail revealed a deeper level of complexity, much intricacy and perplexity, that none of us could understand the connections between these violent incidents that appeared to be random after weeks of feeling suspicious, and I kept looking over my shoulder. But eventually I knew I had to do. If I ever wanted to talk to my trucker friends about Sasha the sadist, we had to determine her identity and the reason behind her driving fearlessly once more. Aimed at us, I started learning more about the other drivers who had been. To my astonishment, after being harassed by Sasha, I discovered the pattern. The truckers had met her at seedy roadside pubs in each instance, and diners like me. We all appeared to have committed a little infraction. Complaint against her for accidentally bumping into her or spilling a glass that set. As we proceeded to piece together further details, I observed that many of Sasha's victims reported that she had a distinctive tattoo on her arm that showed a complex snake coil. It caught my attention as a potential lead around what looked to be a broken steering wheel. One afternoon, just outside of Reno, I was at a dusty truck stop to get fuel. I saw a weary-looking woman with an unmistakable snake tattoo on her arm. Trying to stay composed behind the desk, I determined that this was my opportunity to learn more about Sasha. While attempting to avoid giving anything away, I discreetly, when asked about her tattoo, the woman hesitated for a short while prior to informing me that it was intended to commemorate her deceased sister Veronica, who was once Veronica, a long-distance driver herself, perished in a horrific collision. brought on by the negligence of another trucker when she related her sister's story, and I remembered an old newspaper article that described the horrific catastrophe where after the collision, Veronica's automobile caught fire, and when I asked for further information, the woman disclosed that as a child, Veronica had always been protective of their family. She vowed to exact revenge when she was tragically killed by another driver from beyond the grave on any motorist who failed to treat the road and other drivers with the appropriate respect. The pieces came together as I thanked her for sharing her experience. Veronica's vindictive spirit, Sasha, was punishing the drivers who had harmed her. Seeing her family members equipped with this newfound understanding at our subsequent stop, I gathered my trucking friends, and we made a commitment to share the information about Sasha's origins, is advising all truck drivers to use greater caution when performing their duties. Stories of Sasha's attacks gradually started to disappear from recollection. Stories of Veronica the ghost, who has a snake tattoo on her arm, are being told by truckers, awaiting retribution for those who were insulted or injured by their negligence. Colleagues' lives gradually began to return to anything approaching normalcy. Despite being aware of the background, we were nonetheless a little troubled by the memory of those frightful nights. Sasha's fury somewhat allayed our anxieties as we embarked on a new phase in our life, as truck drivers are safer, more watchful, and always conscious of the consequences of my careless driving at times. When I pulled over at a late at night, I thought I saw Sasha's silhouette at a deserted truck stop, looking back at me from just out of my line of sight. But maybe that continual reminder of we needed Veronica's spirit watching over us to help us control ourselves. A reminder that, on these lengthy asphalt roads, we should always show each other respect. Anyway, it didn't seem like there was a deliberate attempt to respect and compensate one another. We were temporarily spared from Sasha's fury, thanks to Veronica's tribute. Yet occasionally, when all is silent, in the middle of those darkest hours on the road, aside from my own engine's roar, I can't help but wonder if there is a real end to her vengeance,